this might look pretty familiar. If you've installed any version of Ubuntu, or in my case I've got Pop! OS, or even really the default shell for most Linux distributions is going to be bash. And there's nothing wrong with bash or the born again shell. It's a great shell and I've used it for years, really. There is another option, an alternative solution when it comes to your shell, and that is zshell or zsh. Or if you're Australian like me, you might say zshell. Irregardless, zshell, and this is the website on the right hand side, is a POSIX compliant shell. So it can run POSIX scripts just like bash, and you consider it in a way a kind of superset of bash. It adds on additional functionality, but you can still run all the POSIX scripts, right? Which differs from fish, for example. In this video, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through in this fresh install that I've got here from a very basic bash shell to a customized zsh shell, and that's going to be with some plugins that we're going to use. Specifically, we're going to have auto-suggestions, we're going to have syntax highlighting, we're going to have vi-mode, we're going to stylize our prompt, and we're going to do this all ourselves. We're not going to rely on any kind of plugin manager. It's going to be very readable, simple code, and it's going to be encapsulated in just a few files, so you can always come back to it in the future and fully understand what's happening. So the first thing that we've got to do when we have our new machine, or maybe you're on an existing machine, we just want to check, okay, what kind of shell are we actually running, because we don't necessarily know. And so to do this, we're just going to run echo, and then you can run this command. It's going to tell us, okay, well, we're running bash in my case, and this is the default for this distribution, which is Pop! OS, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a great distribution, especially for beginners, and it's based off Ubuntu, but it has a lot of functionality and a lot of optimization on top of Ubuntu. In any case, it still ships with this default bash shell, and we can see that. So what we need to do is we need to install zsh, and we can do that using the sudo apt install zsh command. Now, I've already got it installed, but in your case, if you don't have zsh installed, it'll tell you. And so now we can have a look and just confirm that zsh is installed. We can see it's in the same directory under universal system resources and then bin, and it's zsh rather than bash. Great. So now we still have our old shell as bash. We haven't changed our shell. We can run zsh, and I'm going to do it to show you what your configuration could look like depending on the decisions that you make at the end of this video. So here I hit zsh, and you can see that this is our zsh shell, or this is the shell that I've configured based on the decisions that I've made. You can customize this. I'm going to show you how. But let's quickly just take a look at what's different. The first thing that's different, obviously, is that the prompt has styling. It's got icons here. The penguin for the Linux operating system. It's got the home icon to indicate that this is home directory. And if we have a look, we can also get syntax highlighting. So for example, if we type in ec, that's not a valid command, but if we type in echo, then we can see, okay, that is a valid command. It's now green. If we press the up arrow, we can see the substring history. So we can not only search through our history, but we can also, based on the first command, then look at any substrings that are associated. So you can see the different commands that I've made. And then finally, I hit the red, which indicates that we have exhausted all of our options. We have vi-mode. So we might say, go into normal mode or otherwise visual mode, and we can use that to navigate our shell more easily. If you don't use VI mode, if you're not a Vim user, that's totally fine. I'm going to show you how you can set your system up as well. And so that's just a quick preview on what you could have your shell end up looking like. And now let's go. We've still got a little bit of work to do. We've installed zsh. Let's exit out of this. And this is what your shell is going to look like, hopefully, or similar to this. And what we need to do before we can proceed, if you recall, we looked at our shell and we said that it's bash. So we need to tell our system, don't use bash anymore. We've installed this even better shell. And so let's go and change our shell. And that's going to be to the location of zsh, so we can use the which command. Anything within these $ and then brackets just indicates evaluate this command first and then pass this as the argument. So that's all that's going on there. Provide your password. Now, you'll notice that it hasn't updated yet, so we need to log out and then come back, and we'll find that our zsh has been configured and we will be prompted to set some things up. We've logged back into our machine and we're presented the next time that we open our terminal with this message from zshell. It's detected that we're new users and we don't yet have a configuration in place, and so therefore we need to go ahead and create one. Now, there's a few options in here. We can quit and do nothing, we can exit, and it'll just create a .zshrc file, which is the configuration file for zsh, the main configuration file, and that would be fine. But what I'm going to suggest is that we just have a look at the menu quickly. So we can hit 1 and that'll take us to the menu. In here we can see that we've got some options. So we can configure the settings for history, and by default zsh doesn't include history, but history is an incredibly useful tool when it comes to your shell, and I would highly recommend that we configure that. So let's do that. We just hit 1. In here we've got the hist size, the hist file, and the save hist. For the moment, I'm just going to change the hist size and I'm going to make that 110,000. You can make it whatever you like, but typically I make it a really large number because I like to have all of that history available. Next, we can leave the hist file where it is for the moment. We're going to change it later to move everything out of our home directory, but we can change our save hist, and I ordinarily make that just slightly smaller. So now we can hit 0 and we've got some basic settings set up there. Next, we can go to our configuration for completion, and this is completion, which is baked into zsh. We're going to also be looking at an auto-suggestion plugin which builds upon this using your history and so forth, but this is a basic configuration for completion. And so if we hit 2, we're going to just use the default options, which is the first one. If we hit 1, I would encourage you, when you get a chance, have a look at 2. You can see what other options are available and so forth, but for the time being, let's hit 1. We've got finally some of the more common shell options. I'm going to be taking you through all of the shell options, so no need to necessarily use that for the moment. Why don't we exit? And by the way, on point 3, configure how keys behave when editing the command line. Towards the end of this video, I'm going to show you how you can set it up either for using vi-mode, or otherwise if you want to use not vi-mode, if that's your thing, we can talk about that another time and why you should be using vi-mode. But let's go ahead and we're going to simply hit 0. That's going to exit out. It's going to save. So nothing's changed, right? We can't really see any changes. But if we go and we have a look using our editor, now you might use Nano if you're a beginner, or if you're not, then you use whichever editor that you would like. Let's just go and have a look. There is a file that's been generated in our home directory, and it's called our .zshrc, and this is the file that we were just configuring. So you can see that our history has been set up, and we've got the completion and the completion file name, and we've also got some additional completion options there. But essentially this is really basic configuration, and we haven't changed the look of our prompt yet. We haven't got auto suggestions, we don't have syntax highlighting, so still a very basic setup. But it's important to note that that's been created, and this is our main file when it comes to configuring our zsh shell. So we've got a few files, but the .zshrc file is where the majority of your configuration will be found. So let's quit out of that. And the first thing I want to point out is we've got this zshrc file in our home directory, and ordinarily I don't like to have too much cluttering up the home directory, so we're going to shift it into our .config, which is really a more modern approach. So what we can do, we can say cd and go to our .config, and in here we can see, if we use ls, we've got a bunch of other programs that are on this system, and they happen to have these configuration folders, or directories rather. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new directory, and that's going to be for our zsh. Now, we've still got our .zshrc file in our home directory. So we go back to our home directory. We can do that using this command, and we can confirm that by using pwd to print the working directory. And now what we can do, let's move our .zshrc file, and we're going to put it into config and then zsh. So we've got a basic zshrc file, and we've moved it into the config directory to be more orderly as programmers, because we are disciplined and orderly programmers. But our system does not yet know where to look for that file. It's still looking for it in the home directory. So we need to go ahead and we need to set it up so that it knows where to look. Let's do that. So the problem we have is that zshell doesn't know where to look for our configuration files. And so here I just want to quickly introduce the different configuration files that we need to be aware of when it comes to zshell. And there's a few that you need to be more concerned with than others. So on the right hand side, there's this stack exchange response, which is an excellent summary of what these different files do and what they entail. So the first file is always sourced, and it's our zsh-env file. And so here we can actually set things like our path, our editor, and pages. And importantly, we can also set our z.dir. And what this is it's the directory where we're going to be keeping our .zsh files, our configuration files for zsh. Now, just while we're here, we've also got a z profile for the login shell, and we can use that as well. I ordinarily don't include too much in there, but you can add in some profile specific settings. The .zsh file, zshrc file, is for the interactive shells, and this is where we can set all of our options, our aliases. This is ordinarily where we're going to be doing the majority of our configuration, and also sourcing all of our files that pertain to our configuration. The last two to be aware of are the z login, which is sourced after the .zshrc file, and then z logout, which is the last one, which just clears the terminal, resets everything. So important to note, zsh-env is always sourced first, and it allows us to set the z.dir. So that means that we can tell it, don't look into our home directory, look into our .config zsh directory. That's where you're going to find all of our configurations. So let's go and let's do that. So we know that our .zsh-env file is always sourced, and it's sourced before the other configuration files. That means that we can set our z.dir to tell zsh where to look for our configuration files. Now, you could either do this in your home directory, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to set it up in the system-wide configuration files. The good thing about this is that we only have to set it up here once. We don't have to clutter up our home directory. So let's go and do that. I'm going to go to sudo and then our editor command, whatever you're using, and then etc zsh and then zsh, and we've got the options here of zsh-env is the one that we're concerned with. So let's hit that. Now in here, it's going to look pretty similar to this, hopefully. Now let's go to the very bottom, and I just want you to insert some additional code. And what that is, this is our xdg config home. So what this is saying is if you don't have an xdg config home, that is to say that this variable is not set, then we want to set it to our home directory and then our .config directory. And by the way, this xdg config home just refers to the standard variable name for our configuration home directory. So set that in the first if statement. And then in the second one, what we're going to say is if we have a directory in the xdg config home of xdg config home, so home.config and then zsh, then go and set our z.dir to that directory. So if we refer back over here, we had our z.dir variable, and this is telling zsh where to look for our configuration files. So we've set this up so it will no longer look in our home directory. It will now look into a .config and then zsh into that directory there. So just write and exit out of that. Now go ahead and reload your terminal, and the next time that you open the terminal, we're almost ready to start theming our prompt, but we just want to confirm that the system-wide configuration settings to look for our dot files for our zshrc or our zsh configuration files is a setup. So let's echo out the variable that we set for our z.dir. So we can do that with echo and then z.dir, and we'll see that that has been correctly configured. So now it knows where to look for our zshrc and our other zsh configuration files, and that's been set up so we don't need them in the home directory. In the next step, we're going to style our prompt. So by default, zsh is pretty ugly. It just has the operating system that I have here followed by this percentage sign. It's not a great look, and there are many different ways to style your prompt. It's up to you how you'd like to do it, but this power level 10K theme is exceptionally popular, and I think it does a great job out of the box, and it's also customizable. So let's go ahead and let's install it. I'll drop the link in the description to the video. If we scroll down a little bit, it gives a little bit of a summary, but we can go down here and we can see that there's an installation guide. Now, if you want, you can use a plugin manager. I don't use it. I don't think it's necessary, but there are instructions if you're using a plugin manager. For us, we're going to do it manually. And we can see here that we've got manual instructions to clone the Git repository. The way that we're going to do this, and there's different ways that you can do it, but inside our zsh configuration directory that we've created, I'm going to have a plugins directory. We're going to clone in the theme that we've got here in front of us, as well as the other plugins that we're going to be using in our zsh configuration, and we're going to be putting them there in that directory. You can ultimately choose where you'd like to have these plugins, up to you, but that's what we're going to do for the purpose of this tutorial. So let's grab this first line and let's have a look at it. I'm going to just point out that because the default configuration assumes that we are working from our home directory, and as I've mentioned, we don't want to do that. We want to replace this second part, this power level 10K, which is where we are going to be cloning this theme, and we want to replace that with our z.dir that we set, right? So let's go ahead. We're going to do that. We'll hit enter. We can see that it's expanded z.dir into what we've set it to. So home, rad, config, zsh, power level 10K, and I made a mistake there. So we want to put that into a plugins directory actually. Let's go ahead and let's cd into that directory and let's shift it. So let's go ahead. We're going to do cd.config zsh, and in here let's have a look. We've got this power level 10K. Let's make a new directory called plugins, and let's move the power level 10K into the plugins directory. Now if we have a look in that directory, we've only got the plugins, and if we look into the plugins, we'll see we've got power level 10K. So this is the structure which I think is ordinarily better. Now when we're ready, let's run the second command in the powerline 10K manual instructions. We've just made a slight adjustment though. So we want the source to be in that plugins directory in our z.dir, and we want to place this into our .zsh directory, which is obviously in that z.dir directory. Now let's go and have a look in there. You'll see that we've now got this line down the bottom, which is sourcing the power level 10K theme. Let's just put a space in there. But so importantly, the next time that we source our .zshrc configuration file, then we are going to invoke this power level 10K zsh theme over here. So let's do that. We can quit out, and in here let's source that configuration file, and we're going to be given this wizard, and I encourage you to go ahead and answer all the questions as it fits to your specific environment. But in my case, it's going to ask some questions like, does that look like a diamond? It does. Does that look like a lock? It does. Does this look like an upwards arrow? It does. Now here it says, do all these icons fit between the crosses? No, they don't. And then it's going to ask us for our prompt style. So I'm just going to choose, in my case, I prefer classic, but let's just choose something different for a change, rainbow. And then we're going to have two options. We can have Unicode or we can have ASCII. Now, in my case, I've installed a nerd font, and so I'm going to go ahead and choose Unicode, but you can choose ASCII as well. It's ultimately up to you. So I'm going to hit 1, Do we want to show the time over here? I think it's unnecessary, so I'm going to hit no. Then it's going to ask us what kind of prompt separators we'd like. So see this round or slanted, vertical. So I like round, and I also like a round at the end. And then the last item, it says, would you like the prompt tails to be? And I like this blurred effect, so where it gradually fades in. So let's select 2. Prompt height, so I'm going to have everything on one line, and I like it to be compact. And I do like to have icons, so I'm going to hit 2. In here, we've got this option of having it concise or fluent. Fluent just means it's going to add some additional words here to give you more context, but I think it's necessarily not required, so I'm going to hit 1. Now, enable transient prompt is going to, if you run a command, and the command's now in the history, it will then strip it down and strip down the styling. I think that's unnecessary. Go ahead and choose what you would like those. I'm going to hit N. And then finally, it's going to say instant prompt mode. Here, you can just go ahead and hit 1. That's the recommended configuration, or in your own time, go and explore the other options that we've got there. Now, here it's saying that this power level config file already exists because I already ran this configuration wizard. But the important part is that we've got this correct path, .config zsh .p10k.zsh, and I'm just going to say yes to overwrite that. Now you should have this final confirmation, and it says that this power level 10k is going to apply some changes to your .zshrc, and then just simply say yes. Immediately you'll see that our prompt style or theme is completely different. So we've got icons now, we've got this rounded look, we can see the directory that we're in, and I think it's a much better experience. So let's just go and see what the power level 10k added into our .zshrc file. We can do that using our editor, and we're going to just say zshrc, assuming we're in that directory. And you will see that here we've got some additional syntax, and all this does is just goes and loads that configuration. And then down the bottom, it's going to have this option. If we go right down to the bottom of the file, you'll see here. And what this does, it says if there's no file, then go ahead and source that wizard. So that's what happened earlier. And we can actually run this configuration. If you're not happy with the options that you selected, let's just exit out of this. You can always just run p10k and then configure, and it'll take you back through the wizard. So there you go. Your prompt is now styled. Now, one nice little customization that I ordinarily will do with power level 10k is that I will change the icon there where we have the penguin, because we're using a Linux distribution, to the specific distribution. So if you're on Arch Linux, you could load the Arch logo. Myself, I'm using Pop! OS. So the way that I can do that, and importantly, as I mentioned before, if you want to have these icons, you do need to install a nerd font, so go ahead and do that. But now I'm going to search for Pop! OS in the nerd font cheat sheet, and I can simply search for it like this. And in here, we can simply copy the icon, and if we go to our ZSH directory, we'll see that this .p10k.zsh configuration file was generated when we were going through the power level 10k wizard. Now, if we search for OS icon, we'll see down here on line 189 for myself that there is a custom icon option. And so go ahead and paste in your icon into this icon content expansion there and save this. Now we can source our .zshrc file, and we'll see that we now have the Pop! OS icon in place of the Linux penguin. In this next step, I'm starting to go crazy because every time I have to invoke my editor, I have to write nvim because I'm using neovim instead of just vim. So that's an example of one of the aliases that I like to use. And you may like to use all kinds of different aliases in your system and your workflow. So let's go ahead and let's set up our alias file, which you can add to. I'm going to show you some examples of the aliases that I set, but you can ultimately use whatever you'd like. You can expand on what I've got. And the way that we're going to do that is in our ZSH directory there in our configuration, we're just going to create a new file, and we're going to call that alias-rc. And then in here, let's just go and have a look in that file. Now, it's obviously going to be empty, and so we need to load in some alias or set our aliases. I'm going to just read out from my configuration. So in here, we have a bunch of different aliases. So we've got some very general aliases for grep and diff and remove, move commands. And as I mentioned earlier, I ordinarily will use vim to open nvim just because that's a habit that I've had and developed over the years. But all of these are basically just in the general alias group. We've also got some git aliases there that I've added, as well as tmux, and then finally an alias there for my dotfiles. And I've got more aliases than this. This is just an example of what you might have, and you can expand on this. And now what we want to do, because we've got all these aliases set up here, is we want to save that. And let's go, and we're going to go back to edit our zsh-rc file. And you need to, here on line 8, source that file. So the way that I've done that is I've said, okay, if there is a file in this z.dir, and we know that that is our .config zsh, and the file is going to be called alias-rc, then go ahead and source it. So let's do that. I'm going to source our zsh-rc. This is how we can reload it. And now when I say vim, it now is using that vim alias. So we've set up aliases. Now it's time to set some options that zsh exposes. And if we think back to the sequence of loading of the different configuration files, and in the Stack Exchange comment, there is a point made that in your .zshrc file, it exposes this setopt option, and we can configure certain behaviors of our shell. So let's go and create a new file. It's going to be called option-rc, I call it. You can call it whatever you like. And I'm going to read in my usual configuration again, just like I did with aliases. And in here, we just have some basic options. So the first one being that we can autocorrect mistakes, then globbing with respect to regular expressions with the star sign, case insensitive globbing. So some of these might be personal. You can ultimately use what you'd like. But then some of the more important ones down here are, for example, no beep, so that the terminal doesn't make any sounds, and append history, so it will add to your history, which is important when we get to the auto suggestions, because all of our auto suggestions are based off our history. And then we want to ignore duplicates in our history, so if you run the same command twice, then it won't show up twice in our history. Another great option is auto cd, so we don't have to prefix our cd into a directory with the cd command. We can simply type the directory name and it will automatically cd into that directory. And then once again, another history setting, and then this is optional. You can use this if you like, but this just says, okay, if there's a space at the beginning of your command, you can ignore it. Now, there are more options, of course. Go ahead and look up those options, but these are the options that I will ordinarily use with respect to my configuration. And so these are the options that have been set. Now we do need to go to our zsh-rc file again, and if you have a look down here, I'm sourcing that just like I did with the alias-rc file. Just going to remove that. So we need to source our option rc, and now we're going to get the correct behavior with respect to our history with the auto cd. So let's just go and have a look at that. Now if I just hit home, it'll take us to our home directory. We didn't need to do this cd command. So that is auto cd. That's just one of the examples of the options that I set. Now we can also go and have a look at our history, and we'll see that our history is all being set. So one of the options that we set, for example, was no duplicates. So if I run clear again and I run history, you'll see that clear only occurs once in the history. But now if we say echo, say hello world, hello YouTube, and we go to our history, then we're going to see that both of those are in the history because they're not duplicates. Next, we're going to set up auto-suggestions, which is one of the best plugins available with respect to ZSH, and it will totally change your life. If you are coming from Bash, then this is going to give you great auto-suggestions based on your history. And you can see the description here. In the GitHub, it suggests commands as you type based on history and also on completions, which we set up earlier. So let's go ahead and we'll install it. There's an installation instructions, and in here we can see there's a bunch of different approaches, but here once again there's manual, and under manual it just once again same pattern. We're going to grab the GitHub and we're going to clone it. Obviously we need to clone it into the correct directory, so I'm going to say .config zsh and then plugins. Now that's done, so I am going to look into that directory. We can see that we've got our zsh-autosuggestion. So now let's go and add that to our plugins. I will close this out here. It's no longer necessary. We just follow this exact same pattern that we did before. So make sure that you're sourcing the correct file in there, and let's exit out. Now we need to source our .zshrc. Now let's see, if we type in source, it's going to give us that last command based on our history. We can hit the right arrow and it will accept that. And if we want, we can also say echo. It's going to say hello YouTube, because that was the most recent command that we did there. So auto suggestions is now set up. Now in this next step, we're going to set up syntax highlighting. So at the moment when we write a command, it doesn't give us any syntax. We can write whatever we like in here, and as you can see, the text is always white, or whatever the theme is that you've got set. So syntax highlighting is great, and I'm going to set that up here. We're going to be using this fast syntax highlighting. Of course, once again, the link will be in the description. So if we scroll down a little bit, then we can see that it gives a brief explanation. It's feature-rich syntax highlighting for ZSH, and there's an installation guide. Once again, we've got all the plugins if you want to go down that route. But in our case, with this example, we're just doing a very basic, clean setup. We don't have to rely on any plugin manager. So let's go ahead and do the manual installation. Now, let's inspect this code here. So if we have a look, we can see that we've got the GitHub URL that we're cloning from, and then we have this path here. Of course, we want to change that path to be config and then zsh and then plugins. And in here, I'm just going to call it fast syntax. What this is highlighting. Great. So now if we go and have a look in that plugin, so just see what we've got in there, we can see that we've got this fast syntax highlighting. And if we go down to this next step in the installation instructions, it tells us that we should be sourcing this plugin. So let's go to our .zshrc file, and I'm going to set up here a plugins section. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to source this. Now, we know, for example, that we want this to actually be the z.dir. So let's just do that. So now we are sourcing that file, and we'll just have to give it the correct directory. Great. So now we're sourcing that. Let's quit out and we'll source our .zshrc. Now, if we go echo, for example, if it's a valid command, then it's going to be green. If it's not valid, it's going to be red. And there's a bunch of other different syntax highlighting with respect to our commands and so forth. Maybe if we wanted to do ls, lah, then we can see that the options are in this lighter color and so forth. So that is syntax highlighting. Now, I was ragging on Fish earlier, and don't take it personally if you're a Fish fan. Fish is actually a pretty cool shell in some ways because it adds in a lot of really great functionality. And that's why I guess it's called the friendly interactive shell. But the problem is it's not really a shell because it's not POSIX compliant. So if you come across certain scripts that are POSIX scripts, then you can run them with bash or zsh, but you can't with fish. So that's my main criticism. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some really great features. And one of those features is zsh-history-substring-search. So this is the zsh implementation of the fish feature. And it states that here. I'm on the GitHub repository, and it says this is a clean room implementation of the fish shell's history search feature. So this is a very cool feature from fish, and here it's been implemented for zsh. So there's no clear instructions with respect to installing it with manual, but we've gone through this a few times now. It's pretty straightforward. We simply grab the URL to the GitHub repository. Then we just need to make sure that we've got the correct location. So we know that the first part, and I'll just close this on the right hand side so you can see it more easily. So we've got this. Now we just need to replace that with z.dir, and we want it to be cloned into our z.dir, our .config, zsh, and then plugins, and then substring search. That's going to be the directory. So it already exists for me because I've already done this. But if you go and you ls into your plugins, you should now see that you've got this history substring search. So ensure that that is there, and then go to your .zshrc. And under the plugins, where we've been adding plugins, I have included it here so you can see that we are sourcing it. And then one additional item that we have to take care of here, and that is that if we come down here on lines 24 to 30, we can see that by default these keys aren't being listened to. So we've got to tell the terminal when you have an up key, then invoke this history substring search up or down. Okay, so what does that do? Make sure you've included all of that, and then write that file. Now we've got to source the zsh-history-substring and reload all of our configurations. Now if we go to echo, we can hit the up arrow and we can see, okay, this light purple color here, this pastel purple, indicates that that is a valid return. So we can see going through, hitting the up arrow, these are all previous commands that began with echo. Eventually we're going to hit this red. That indicates that we've exhausted the list of possible commands that started with echo that are in our history. And this is why it's great to have a really long history, right? Because you may have run a command 6 months ago, and now you can go through and find it. So now hitting the down arrow, and you can map those keys to whatever you like, then we have exhausted it. We're back where we started. And so that is the substring search. And it is a very cool feature that admittedly comes from Fish. So we can all thank the developers of Fish for that feature and the people who ported it to zsh. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to show you how to use the shell best without the VI mode, but then we're going to install the zsh-vi-mode, which is what I use, and what I suggest that at some point, once you're getting familiar, depending on your level, if you've been using the terminal for a while, you're getting familiar with the shell, then go ahead and start learning Vim, because it will improve your productivity. But if you're a beginner, then that's fine as well. And one of the things that you can do is you can follow here on the right hand side. There are some shortcuts that we can navigate better, and these also apply to batch. So for example, we can use Control A, and that will take us to the beginning of the line, or Control E will take us to the end. And if we wanted to, we can delete everything with Control U. That will delete the entire line. But let's say if we wanted to, I'll just find some shorter words. We could use Control K, and that just deletes from where your cursor is to the end of the line, right? Otherwise, we could use Control W. It deletes the word behind the cursor. There are a bunch of other shortcuts in here, and so go ahead and find out some of the really useful ones. So if you do want to use VI mode, then I'm going to close that or shift over here to the zsh-vi-mode. And what this allows you to do is use VI motions, if you're familiar with Vim, within the shell. So let's have a look in here. There's a bunch of documentation as usual. And then finally, there should be a manual install. Once again, exact same pattern. So come in here, have a look. We don't want to install it there. So we're going to run this config zsh plugins and then zsh-vi-mode. We can now have a look. Let's go into our zsh directory, make sure that you're in the right directory, and then ls the plugins just to ensure that it's installed there so we can see it down here. Let's open up our .zshrc configuration file. Just make sure there on line 17 that you've got this source, so we're sourcing that plugin there. And importantly, also in here, I have added some bind keys for the history substring search up and down. So this is important. If we've installed that history substring that we mentioned was one of the great features of Fish, if we want it to work in command or insert mode in the shell, and we're using VI mode, then we need to add these additional bind keys. So just make sure that you've added that. Now let's source our .zshrc to reload it. And now I'm going to just minimize this on the right so we can got a bit more space. You'll notice a change. The cursor is now, when it's in insert mode, it's not that block cursor, it's just that slim line cursor. And we've still got everything here. So we've got the substring search, so we can use that. We've still got auto suggestions and everything. However, let's say we accept that, we can hit escape, and now we can see on the right hand side over here that we're in normal mode. So if we wanted to go to the start of the line, then we can obviously hit 0. These are Vim motions, not going to be able to cover them all now. If we wanted to change this word and go into insert, and we can use CW, and then we might say we want to change this command to ls. Obviously we can use capital D to delete everything. So we've got all of these great Vim motions within our shell now, and that is, if you're a Vim user, obviously great, and I don't need to preach to the choir in this video about why Vim is a great productivity tool. So that's how we would set up VI mode. Congratulations, you've now got a working ZSH configuration, and you can always refer to my dotfiles and my ZSH configuration on GitHub, and I'd also encourage you to check out other people's dotfiles and ZSH configurations, and you'll be able to draw inspiration from them. I will also include some additional code in there which automatically downloads the plugins that we've been working with, so if you set it up on a new machine, it'll download it for you. And in here I just wanted to finish off with some final touches. You can also add in colors, some additional tab completion, and color your man pages with these additional options that I've set in the .zshrc, and of course this is going to be available in the repository. I'd like to thank you very much for taking your time to go through this tutorial. I hope it's been helpful. And if you are interested in moving to NeoVim as your editor, like what you've seen in this video, please do go and check out my NeoVim from scratch video, which will take you all the way through setting up NeoVim as your default editor. Thanks again, and I hope to see you here soon.